The email arrived at 3:13 a.m. No subject line, no sender details, just a single sentence in the body. You're looking in the wrong place. Attached was a list of infant deaths, all from the same hospital, spanning years. Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the names. The dates were erratic, the causes of death vague. Some were ruled as sudden infant death syndrome, others as unexplained complications. But one thing stood out. Each case had been handled by the same nurse, Lucy Letby. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his pulse quickening. He had spent years chasing urban legends, conspiracies, the darkest corners of the internet, but this was different. This was real. There were names, families, dead children, and a nurse who should have raised every red flag imaginable, yet somehow, she never did. He needed a source, someone from inside. By sunrise, Ethan was parked outside a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The woman who lived there had once worked at the same hospital, Olivia Reeves. She had quit abruptly after a breakdown, refusing to speak to any press. Until now. The door opened just a crack. A single eye peered through. No. The door started to close. Ethan wedged his foot in. I know about the babies. Silence. Then, a slow, shuddering breath from the other side. The door unlatched. Inside, the curtains were drawn, the air thick with the scent of old coffee and something stale. Olivia sat across from him, eyes hollow, fingers trembling as she lit a cigarette. She barely inhaled, just let the smoke curl around her like a shield. I don't talk about that place, she muttered. Ethan placed the list of names on the table. The reaction was immediate. Olivia's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing turned shallow. You don't understand, she whispered. Lucy. She wasn't normal. A cold weight settled in Ethan's stomach. Tell me. Olivia hesitated, eyes darting toward the darkened hallway behind her, as if someone else might be listening. She was quiet, always watching, never blinking. Olivia swallowed hard. The babies, they weren't sick before they died. They were fine. Then she'd go in, and... Her voice cracked. She was always there when they took their last breath. Ethan felt the air in the room shift, as if something unseen had stirred. He glanced at the old television in the corner. The screen flickered, static for just a second. You think she killed them? He asked. Olivia's lips barely moved. I think she did something worse. A chill ran through Ethan's spine. He glanced at the stack of hospital reports he had gathered, each one marked by inconsistencies, missing files, unexplained deaths. But none of that compared to what Olivia said next. She's still there. Ethan frowned. Lucy's in prison. Olivia didn't blink. No, she whispered. I mean, she's still at the hospital. I've seen her. Others have, too. She never left. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Ethan felt a prickle at the back of his neck. The air was too still. The shadows in the hallway too deep. He was about to speak when something made him freeze. Somewhere in the house, from the hallway, a sound. A slow, rhythmic beeping, like a heart monitor. But there was no hospital room here. No machines. Just darkness. Ethan turned his head toward the noise, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. But before he could move, Olivia reached across the table, her nails digging into his wrist. Don't look, she whispered. Her eyes were wide, terrified. Ethan swallowed hard. Something was watching him, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure he wanted to see what it was. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something stale, something wrong. Ethan Carter adjusted the press badge hanging from his jacket as the receptionist led him through the sterile white halls toward the administrator's office. The walls were lined with faded photographs of smiling newborns, their tiny hands curled into fists, their eyes unknowing of the horrors that had unfolded here. The administrator, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, greeted him with a forced smile. His nameplate read Daniel Crow. You're digging into old wounds, Mr. Carter, Crow said, folding his hands on the desk. Lucy Letby is behind bars. There's nothing more to say. Ethan placed a USB drive on the desk. Then explain this. Crow hesitated, then plugged it into his computer. The security footage flickered onto the screen. A grainy, time-stamped video from years ago. It showed a hospital corridor at 2:47 a.m. The hallway was dimly lit, the air seemingly thick with shadows. Then, a figure emerged. Lucy let by. She moved slowly, her white uniform barely visible in the low light. She wasn't checking charts, wasn't tending to patients. She was just wandering, her head tilted slightly, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She stopped in front of an empty bassinet and just stood there. Crow exhaled sharply. This is old footage from before the investigation. Ethan leaned in. Keep watching. The timestamp changed. 3:01 a.m. The hallway was empty again. Then, suddenly, Lucy was back, standing in the exact same spot, but her head was turned now, facing the camera, and she was smiling. A hollow, unnatural grin that sent a chill up Ethan's spine. Crow slammed the laptop shut. This is just a glitch. A loop in the recording. Ethan shook his head. Then explain why this footage was recorded 2 weeks ago. Crow's breath hitched. He pushed away from the desk, standing up too fast. This interview is over. Ethan grabbed his notebook. One last question. Have you ever seen her? Crow's lips tightened. His eyes flicked toward the glass window overlooking the empty neonatal ward below. She's gone, he said, but he didn't sound sure. Ethan took the elevator down to the hospital's lower levels. Something didn't feel right. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, he heard whispers. Faint, fleeting, like the distant hum of an old radio. The ward was supposed to be empty, but when he looked at the security monitor in the hall, there was movement. A shadow, a figure, standing in front of an empty bassinet. Ethan's breath hitched. He turned around. The hallway was empty, but he wasn't alone. He could feel her, watching. Olivia's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee cup. The dim light of the diner cast shadows under her tired eyes, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying a burden too heavy for one person. She wasn't like the others, Olivia murmured. Lucy, she always knew. Ethan leaned in, notebook open. Knew what? That they were going to die. A chill prickled his skin. What do you mean? Olivia's gaze flickered toward the diner's window, as if expecting someone to be watching. Every time, every single time. She was already there, Olivia whispered. She'd appear in the doorway, in the corner of the room, silent, still, like she was waiting for it to happen. And then, she trailed off. Ethan swallowed hard. Then what? The machines would start beeping, erratic, frantic, and then flatline. Goosebumps rose on Ethan's arms. I reported it, more than once, but no one listened. Olivia's voice wavered. They never listened. Ethan scribbled furiously in his notebook, but something gnawed at his gut. There had to be more. Do you think she? Don't say it. Olivia's voice sharpened. Her hands clutched the edge of the table like she was bracing herself. I don't care what they say about her being locked up. I don't care if they burned that whole hospital down. She's still there. Ethan exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temples. I need more than just stories, Olivia. I need proof. She hesitated, then pulled something from her bag. A photo. It was an old hospital security still. Grainy, blurry, but in the far end of the hallway, near an ICU room, a figure in white. Not moving, just standing. Ethan felt his throat go dry. I need to speak to someone who knows the hospital's history, he said. Dr. Harper's office was a cluttered mess of old patient files and dust-covered medical books. The hospital historian was a wiry man with an unsettling habit of never blinking. You shouldn't be digging into this, Mr. Carter, Harper said, flipping through a tattered journal. Some things are best left buried. Ethan placed Olivia's photo on the desk. Tell me about her. Harper's fingers froze. His jaw clenched. She was quiet, he finally said. Too quiet. Nurses said they'd turn corners, and she'd just be standing there, watching. Ethan swallowed. And now? Harper didn't answer right away. He stared past Ethan, his pupils blown wide. Some say they still see her. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A faint beeping. Slow. Steady. The unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat monitor. But there were no machines in Harper's office. Ethan's breath hitched. Do you hear that? Harper didn't move. You should leave. The beeping grew louder. Then, silence. A whisper of cold air brushed against the back of Ethan's neck. His body went rigid. His pulse pounded. He turned slowly. Nothing. But the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. And beneath it, something rotten. Ethan didn't say another word. He grabbed his notebook and bolted for the door. The apartment smelled of stale coffee and dust, a place abandoned by light. Julia sat on the couch, knees drawn up, fingers twitching against the fabric. Her eyes were hollow, haunted by something she could never forget. Ethan placed his recorder on the table. Tell me what you remember. Julia didn't look at him. She stared at the far corner of the room, her breath uneven. She used to hum, she whispered. Ethan frowned. Hum. Julia swallowed. Not like a song, like a lullaby. Soft, sweet, like she was comforting them. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. But they weren't crying, were they? He asked. Julia's lips trembled. No. Ethan's stomach twisted. She'd stand there, humming, just before the monitors went flat. Like she knew. Like she was guiding them. Julia's voice cracked on the last words. A long silence hung between them. Then, thump. Ethan stiffened. Thump. Thump. The sound was coming from inside the apartment. Julia's breathing hitched. No, she whispered. Not here. Not now. Ethan shot to his feet, scanning the room. What was that? Julia's hands clutched the arms of the couch, her knuckles white. Then, a slow creak. Ethan turned his head toward the hallway. A door. Opening. Is someone here? He asked, his voice low. Julia shook her head, eyes wet with terror. It's been locked for years. But the nursery door at the end of the hall, it was open now. Ethan grabbed his recorder, heart hammering. Stay here. Julia didn't argue. He moved slowly, every step against the wooden floor too loud, too real. The nursery was nothing but a storage room now, or at least it should have been. Ethan reached the doorway. Inside, dust floated in the moonlight. A crib sat in the center of the room, empty. Then, the lullaby. Faint, distant, coming from nowhere. Ethan's skin turned to ice. His fingers fumbled for his recorder, pressing play on a voice memo he had taken from the hospital days ago. At first, nothing. Just static. Then, breathing. Slow. Shallow. Like something waiting. And then, in the dead silence, a whisper, right against his ear. SHHHH, they're sleeping. Ethan spun around, but the room was empty. The hospital archives were buried deep beneath the main building, in a storage room that smelled of mildew and forgotten things. Mr. Langley, an aging archivist with deep-set eyes, led Ethan down the narrow hallway, the overhead lights flickering with each step. No one's been down here in years, Langley muttered, unlocking a rusted metal door. You're sure about this? Ethan hesitated. The air was thick with dust, each breath tasting stale, but he had no choice. Inside, rows of metal lockers stood in eerie silence, their numbers peeling off with age. Then he saw it. Locker number 319, Lucy Letby. The name tag was still there, untouched by time. Langley shuffled behind him. I'll be outside. Don't take too long. The door groaned shut, leaving Ethan alone. His fingers hovered over the locker handle. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled it open. A musty scent spilled out. Rotting paper, something else, something foul. Inside, neatly stacked folders lay forgotten, brittle with age. And beneath them, a small, leather-bound book. Ethan picked it up. The edges were torn, the pages warped. His pulse quickened as he flipped through the first few pages. Crude drawings. Tiny, lifeless figures. Words scratched in jagged handwriting. They belong to me now. Ethan swallowed hard. The entries were disturbing, filled with strange ramblings. Nursery rhymes twisted into something dark. Mothers cry, fathers grieve, but only I know when they leave. His breath hitched. Then he saw it. A torn-out page, ripped violently from the spine. And on the next page, a name written in shaky ink. Ethan Carter. His blood turned to ice. His name, in Lucy Letby's diary. Before he could react, a sudden noise. The locker door slammed shut behind him. The single overhead bulb flickered once. Then, darkness. Dr. Harper sat stiffly in his office chair, his fingers trembling as he flipped through Lucy Letby's diary. The sterile glow of the desk lamp cast deep shadows on his face, making his hollowed eyes look even darker. This shouldn't exist, he whispered. Ethan leaned forward. What do you mean? Harper exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. These entries, they describe things that happened before anyone even suspected her. Things that no one else should know. Ethan's throat tightened. Like what? Harper hesitated, then read aloud. The night nurse will leave her post at 2:57 a.m. The machines will beep, but she won't hear. I will be there. I will watch. I will wait. He swallowed hard. This matches the exact timeline of one of the first infant deaths, down to the second. A chill slithered down Ethan's spine. Before he could respond, a sound cut through the silence. A baby's cry. Ethan and Harper froze. It was faint, distant, yet unmistakable, the fragile wail of a newborn. Harper shook his head. No, that's impossible. It grew louder, closer. Ethan shot up, scanning the dimly lit hallway beyond the office door. The hospital wing was empty. It had been shut down for years. Still, the cries continued, echoing from somewhere deep within the abandoned ward. Harper grabbed his arm. Don't go out there. But Ethan had already moved, stepping into the hallway. The air was thick, suffocating. Each step felt heavier than the last. As he neared the old neonatal unit, his breath caught in his throat. Through the glass window of the nursery room, a figure stood in the dim light. Lucy Letby, pale, motionless, her expression unreadable. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. Then she smiled. Not at him, at his reflection. He turned his head sharply, but there was no one behind him. The glass shattered, the cries stopped, and in the sudden silence, a whisper slithered through the air. You shouldn't have come. The hospital morgue was colder than Ethan expected. The scent of disinfectant and something stale lingered in the air, pressing against his senses. The dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the steel cabinets lining the walls. The mortuary attendant, an older man with sunken eyes, barely glanced up as Ethan stepped inside. I just need to check something, Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The attendant sighed, sliding open a heavy metal drawer labeled Unknown Infant. It was empty. Ethan's stomach twisted. Where is the body? The attendant frowned. No one's touched this drawer in years. The log says the body was never moved. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the files he had stolen from the hospital's database. There it was, a case from years ago. A baby that had died under suspicious circumstances, assigned to Lucy Letby's care. Except, there had never been an autopsy. No proper records. No cause of death listed. Ethan turned to the attendant. Do you have security footage of this room? The man hesitated but nodded, leading Ethan to an old monitor in the corner. The grainy footage played, time-stamped from 3 a.m. the night before. At first, nothing. Just stillness. Then, the drawer slid open on its own. Ethan's breath hitched. The attendant took a step back. A moment passed. Then, from the shadows of the open drawer, something moved. Tiny fingers. A small, fragile hand. Then the screen flickered violently, static crackling through the speaker. And then, a face appeared. Pale, lifeless. A baby's face. Mouth open in a silent scream. The feed cut to black. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. The attendant stood frozen, his lips parted, but no words coming out. Then, behind them, a metal drawer creaked open. The air grew thick, heavy. A suffocating presence filled the room. And then, ever so faintly, Ethan heard it. A wet, rattling breath. He turned. The empty drawer wasn't empty anymore. Something lay inside. Something small, wrapped in a decayed hospital blanket. And then, the blanket moved. The air inside Olivia's small apartment was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. She sat across from Ethan, her fingers trembling as she held Lucy Letby's diary in her lap. The dim lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller than it was. "I saw her write their names," Olivia whispered. "Before the babies died. She wrote them down first." Ethan's skin prickled. "You mean, she planned it?" Olivia shook her head. "Not exactly. It was like she was marking them, as if once she wrote a name, their fate was sealed." She hesitated before flipping the diary open. The pages were brittle, stained with ink that had bled into the paper like veins. Some of the names were crossed out. Others were underlined. Ethan leaned in, scanning the scrawled handwriting. Then, his breath caught. His name was there. Ethan Carter. Marked. Underlined. Dated today. His pulse pounded in his ears. "This is impossible," he muttered. Then, a sharp pain shot through his skull. Warmth dripped from his nose. He touched his upper lip and stared at his fingers. They were coated in blood. A sudden gasp from Olivia made him look up. She clutched her throat, her face turning red, veins bulging at her temples. Her body jerked violently as if unseen hands were squeezing the life out of her. "Olivia!" Ethan lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders. Her eyes rolled back, her lips forming silent, desperate words. The diary slid from her lap, its pages fluttering wildly, even though there was no breeze. Ethan grabbed it and slammed it shut, and Olivia gasped for air, collapsing onto the couch. The room fell silent. The only sound was Olivia's ragged breathing. Ethan looked down at the diary, its leather cover warm, almost pulsing. Lucy Letby was dead, but she was still writing. The hospital at night was a different world, one filled with hushed voices, flickering lights, and the constant, underlying sense that something unseen was moving just beyond sight. Ethan stood near the nurse's station, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, watching the exhausted night shift nurse pour herself a cup of stale coffee. She wouldn't look at him, wouldn't meet his eyes. "You said the walls breathe," Ethan finally said. The nurse flinched at his words, her fingers tightening around the cup until they turned white. "I shouldn't have told you that," she whispered. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan leaned in. "Tell me what you meant." The nurse swallowed hard. "At night, when it's quiet, the walls inhale." Ethan frowned. "What?" She set down the cup, her gaze distant, haunted. "You can hear it. The walls take in air, slow and deep, and then they exhale." A chill ran through Ethan. "Whispers," she added in a broken voice. "You can hear them whispering." The words lodged in his chest like ice. He turned away, pulse hammering, and slowly walked down the dim hallway. He reached out and pressed his palm against the wall. For a moment, it was just a wall, cold, solid, unmoving. Then, it shifted beneath his fingers. The sensation was subtle at first, like a heartbeat beneath flesh. Then it convulsed, a slow, rhythmic movement, like something trapped inside was trying to push through. Ethan yanked his hand back, his breath coming fast. A whisper slithered through the air. He turned sharply, searching the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, flickering. Then, his phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the notification. Motion detected. Security camera 3B. His fingers trembled as he tapped the screen, pulling up the live feed. The grainy footage showed the hallway just outside the nursery. At first, it looked normal, empty. Then, a shadow moved. Not a person, just the shadow, stretching unnaturally across the floor, shifting, elongating. But there was no body to cast it. Ethan's stomach twisted. He needed to find that missing page before whatever was inside these walls found him first. The tape recorder felt heavy in Ethan's hands, its plastic casing worn from years of neglect. He stared at the label, LL, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. His gut twisted. Lucy Letby. Dr. Harper stood beside him, arms crossed, his face pale. "You sure you want to do this?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pressed play. At first, there was only static. A low, droning hiss that made his skin prickle. Then, a voice. Soft, humming. It was a lullaby, slow and deliberate, drifting through the speakers like a ghost's breath. Ethan's mouth went dry. Dr. Harper stiffened. That's her. The melody was sweet, almost gentle, but beneath it, something was wrong. A sharp inhale, a tiny, gasping breath, a baby struggling for air. Ethan's fingers dug into the table as the gasps grew weaker, fading into silence. The humming continued, unbothered, unchanged. Dr. Harper swallowed hard. Turn it off. Ethan reached for the stop button. His phone rang. The shrill tone shattered the moment, making both men jump. With shaking hands, Ethan pulled it from his pocket. No caller ID. He hesitated, then answered. Static. Then, his own voice, hollow and distorted. You're next. Ethan's breath hitched. A cold whisper brushed against his ear. He spun around, but the room was empty. Dr. Harper grabbed the recorder and slammed it shut, his hands trembling. She's not just watching anymore. Ethan could still hear the lullaby, lingering in his head. Lucy Letby wasn't done. She was hunting. Ethan flipped through the brittle hospital records, his pulse quickening. 5 infants, each one listed as deceased. But there were no burial records, no death certificates. They had simply vanished. The archivist, an elderly man with trembling hands, leaned in. We don't talk about those cases. His voice was barely a whisper. They were different. Ethan's grip tightened on the files. How? The man hesitated. They were never found. Their bodies gone. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Determined, he made his way to Lucy Letby's old room, now a storage closet. He pushed the door open and froze. The walls, scratched, gouged, scarred with names. The same 5 names from the records. His breath hitched. The scratches weren't old. They were fresh. The air turned icy. His exhale came out in a cloud. A soft creak echoed behind him. He turned, and the door slammed shut on its own. Darkness swallowed him whole. Then, whispers. Faint, childlike. The temperature kept dropping. Ethan's teeth chattered. His flashlight flickered, then cut out. Tiny footsteps skittered across the room. He held his breath. A giggle. Too close. Right behind him. The whispers grew louder. A chorus of voices, chanting, pleading. Then, a single name hissed from the shadows. Ethan. His blood ran cold. The closet door burst open. Light flooded in, and the whispers vanished. Ethan stumbled out, gasping. He turned back. The names were gone, but something had changed. The hospital wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted him to stay. Ethan flipped through the brittle hospital records, his pulse quickening. 5 infants, each one listed as deceased. But there were no burial records, no death certificates. They had simply vanished. The archivist, an elderly man with trembling hands, leaned in. We don't talk about those cases. His voice was barely a whisper. They were different. Ethan's grip tightened on the files. How? The man hesitated. They were never found. Their bodies gone. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Determined, he made his way to Lucy Letby's old room, now a storage closet. He pushed the door open and froze. The walls, scratched, gouged, scarred with names. The same 5 names from the records. His breath hitched. The scratches weren't old. They were fresh. The air turned icy. His exhale came out in a cloud. A soft creak echoed behind him. He turned, and the door slammed shut on its own. Darkness swallowed him whole. Then, whispers. Faint, childlike. The temperature kept dropping. Ethan's teeth chattered. His flashlight flickered, then cut out. Tiny footsteps skittered across the room. He held his breath. A giggle. Too close. Right behind him. The whispers grew louder. A chorus of voices, chanting, pleading. Then, a single name hissed from the shadows. Ethan. His blood ran cold. The closet door burst open. Light flooded in, and the whispers vanished. Ethan stumbled out, gasping. He turned back. The names were gone, but something had changed. The hospital wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted him to stay. Ethan leaned over the security monitor, his breath shallow. The grainy footage showed the hospital nursery at exactly 3:13 a.m. A shadow moved in the corner. Then, a figure stepped into the dim light. A nurse. Her uniform was outdated, a pale blue dress with a crisp white apron, just like the ones from decades ago. She shouldn't exist. Ethan's stomach twisted. He zoomed in. The woman stood by an empty crib, her back to the camera. Then, slowly, her head turned. Too far. Bone-crackingly far. Lucy Letby's dead. Hollow eyes stared directly into the lens. The screen glitched, and when it cleared, she was gone. Ethan slammed the laptop shut. This wasn't just a ghost haunting a hospital. It was something else. Something worse. He sprinted to the nursery. The room was empty, except for the soft creak of a rocking chair. Moving. Back and forth. Back and forth. A lullaby hummed through the air. But no one was there. Ethan stepped forward. A freezing hand wrapped around his wrist. Tight. Bone-crushing. His breath hitched. He looked down. There was no one there. But the grip didn't loosen. Instead, a voice slithered into his ear. Soft. Sickly sweet. Lucy's voice. Don't fight it, Ethan. The rocking chair stopped. Ethan was yanked backward. The nursery lights flickered, and everything went black. Ethan forced the rusted door open. The stale air inside thick with something wrong. The room had been sealed for years. Lucy Letby's old office. Dr. Harper hesitated in the doorway. We shouldn't be here. Ethan stepped inside. The dim emergency light flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows. The walls were covered in tiny handprints. Hundreds of them, pressed into the peeling paint, smeared as if the children had been reaching, clawing. A chill slithered down Ethan's spine. Then, from the far corner, a soft whimper, an infant's cry. The sound seeped from the walls, rising into agonized wails. Ethan backed up, his breath sharp. The handprints began to move, fingers twitching, hands pressing outward as if the children inside were still trying to escape. Dr. Harper gasped. The door slammed shut. The cries turned to screams. And over it all, a whisper threaded through the darkness. They never left me, Ethan, and neither will you. The lights died. Ethan sat across from Olivia in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. Olivia's fingers trembled as she lit a cigarette, her eyes distant, haunted. She never blinked, Olivia murmured. When she watched over the babies, she just stared. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She would stand by their cribs for hours, just watching, unmoving, like she was waiting for something. Olivia exhaled sharply. Or listening. A shiver crawled up Ethan's spine. Later that night, he sat in his motel room, sifting through old hospital records. Among them, he found an aged, black and white photograph, Lucy Letby. Something was off. Her eyes. They had been scratched out. Deep, angry gouges where her gaze should have been. The air in the room thickened, pressing against his lungs. At that exact moment, Olivia screamed. Ethan bolted upright, grabbing his phone. The call connected, but Olivia's voice was barely a whisper. She's here. Ethan's blood ran cold. She's outside my window, watching. The line went dead. Ethan pressed his hand against the rusted double doors, the paint peeling beneath his fingertips. The security guard beside him hesitated, his flashlight flickering. This wing was shut down years ago, the guard muttered. After, you know. Ethan didn't answer. He already knew. With a groan, the doors creaked open, revealing a hallway frozen in time. Dust and decay coated everything. But beneath it all, there was something worse, something wrong. The walls. They were covered in handprints. Tiny, smeared prints, some impossibly high up, others dragging down as if the hands had been pulled away. Ethan swallowed hard. He stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his weight. At the end of the corridor, an incubator sat abandoned. Its glass cracked, metal rusting. It began to rock, back and forth. A sharp click echoed as the flashlight died. Then, a whisper, so close it tickled Ethan's ear. Not all of them died. Ethan flipped through the brittle pages of the hospital's archived records, his fingers trembling. His breath hitched when he found the entry. Patient X admitted, the night of Lucy Letby's arrest. No discharge date. No death certificate. Who was this patient? Ethan asked. Dr. Harper's face paled. There was no patient X. Ethan's pulse pounded as he turned the page. Stapled to the report was a security still from a surveillance camera dated years after Lucy's conviction. It showed a crib, and beside it, Lucy let by. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. A soft, rhythmic shuffling echoed from the corridor. Tiny feet. Ethan turned toward the sound, his blood running cold. The corridor was empty, but the shuffling grew louder. Then, in the dim glow of the emergency exit light, a small shadow moved. Olivia's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup, her face pale. "I saw her, Ethan," she whispered. "2 nights ago, in the maternity ward." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "That's not possible." "I know what I saw," Olivia insisted. "She was just standing there, by an empty crib, humming." Ethan swallowed hard. He had recorded every moment of his investigation so far, but the growing dread in his chest told him the answers he sought weren't in the past anymore. That night, he played back his latest audio recording. His own voice filled the room. Lucy let by. "Are you here?" There was silence. Then, a breath, and a voice that was not his own. "Yes." Ethan's heart pounded as he turned toward the door. It creaked open. Inside the darkened room sat a single crib, freshly made. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he pushed open the heavy door to the abandoned nursery ward. The air inside was thick, stale, wrong. Dust clung to every surface, yet the rows of cribs stood eerily untouched, as if waiting. Dr. Harper hesitated at the entrance. "This place was sealed off after everything," he muttered. "No one comes here anymore." Ethan stepped forward, his breath fogging in the unnatural chill. 5 cribs lined the far wall, each containing something wrapped in decayed blankets. He approached the nearest one, slowly peeling back the fabric. A doll. Its porcelain skin was cracked, its eyes a lifeless, glossy black. Ethan exhaled in relief. Just dolls. That's all. A soft creak cut through the silence. Ethan turned toward the last crib. The doll inside slowly twisted its head toward him. The air turned ice cold. Behind him, Dr. Harper whispered, voice barely audible, "Lucy never stopped taking care of them." Olivia jolted awake, heart pounding. The room was suffocatingly cold, the air thick with an unshakable dread. As she rubbed her arms, her breath hitched. Tiny handprints littered her skin, as if small, ice-cold fingers had clung to her in the night. Meanwhile, Ethan descended once more into the hospital morgue, his hands trembling as he pulled open the cold storage drawer. The infant's body, the one that had vanished, was back. But something was different. The tiny corpse was unnaturally still, its mouth slightly open, as though caught in a frozen scream. A breath of icy air brushed the back of his neck. Ethan turned. A skeletal, pale hand shot out from the darkness, closing around his throat, his vision blurred, his pulse hammering. Somewhere in the abyss of shadows, a soft lullaby hummed through the air. Lucy's grip was tightening, and now, she was choosing her next victim. Ethan stood before the decaying remnants of Lucy Letby's childhood home, a hollow shell of a place long abandoned. The windows gaped like empty sockets, the air around it unnaturally still. Neighbors refused to speak of the girl who once lived here, except in hushed, fearful whispers. She never played, never cried, just watched. Inside, dust coated everything, but something felt awake. The floorboards groaned beneath his steps as he made his way to a small, forgotten room. Tucked beneath a rotting bed frame was a diary, Lucy's childhood journal. As Ethan flipped through the brittle pages, his breath hitched. The names of infants who died decades later were written in shaky, childlike scrawl. The final page held a single sentence, one that sent ice through his veins. "They were never mine to take. He told me to." A shadow stirred in the corner of the room. Lucy wasn't the beginning. She was just the messenger. Ethan watched as Olivia ran her fingers over the deep scratches in the peeling wallpaper of Lucy's childhood bedroom. The marks weren't random. They formed words, a nursery rhyme etched with frantic, unsteady hands. "Hush, little one. Don't you cry. Shadows watch, and so will I." Olivia swallowed hard. "It's a lullaby," she whispered. Intrigued, Ethan pulled out his recorder. He hesitated before softly humming the eerie tune. The air around them thickened, charged with something unseen. Then, a baby's giggle echoed from the darkness. Ethan's breath hitched. Olivia grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Tell me you heard that." Before he could answer, something moved in the corner of the room. A shape, not quite human, shifted toward them, its outline flickering like a dying light. Lucy's story wasn't just about murder. It was a ritual, and Ethan had just started it. Ethan stared at the old hospital photograph in his shaking hands. The faded image showed Lucy let by in the neonatal unit, cradling an infant. But something was wrong. The baby's face was blurred, its limbs distorted, as if the camera had refused to capture it properly. Dr. Harper exhaled sharply. "This child was never identified," he muttered. "The records are gone, as if they never existed." A chill crawled down Ethan's spine. Lucy had taken many infants, but one had vanished completely, unregistered, unknown. That night, as he lay in bed, the room felt heavier than usual. The air carried a faint scent of antiseptic, like the hospital corridors. Then, a soft whisper brushed against his ear. "Ethan." It was a child's voice. Ethan's breath caught as tiny footsteps padded across the floor, approaching his bed. Ethan barely had time to process the horrifying revelation of the missing infant before Olivia screamed. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest, her breath ragged. I can hear it," she gasped, eyes wide with terror. "A baby, crying, but it's inside me." Ethan's stomach twisted. There was no baby, only the sound, relentless, echoing through her very being. Desperate for answers, Ethan rummaged through the old hospital archives and found a collection of cassette tapes labeled with Lucy's initials. He played one. A soft, lilting lullaby filled the air, Lucy's voice eerily sweet. But in the background, something else breathed, something hungry. The tape screeched. Then, Lucy spoke. "You can't save them." The recorder shut off by itself. Ethan turned. Olivia's eyes had gone blank, and from her lips, the sound of an infant's wail escaped. Lucy wasn't just haunting them anymore. She was taking them. Ethan's pulse pounded as he stepped into the abandoned nursery. Dust swirled in the dim light, and the faint scent of antiseptic clung to the air. Then he saw it. A crib, pristine and untouched, unlike the decayed furniture around it. A small, yellowed tag hung from the railing. Ethan Carter. His blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he checked the security monitors. The grainy footage played back in slow motion. The crib had been empty, until something lowered a baby inside. Except, there was nothing there. A sharp click echoed through the room. Ethan spun. The nursery door had locked itself. The lights flickered. Shadows twisted along the walls. The whispers began. "You will care for them now." Ethan clutched his head as the voices grew louder, overlapping, pressing into his skull. Lucy had made her choice. And Ethan was never meant to be the investigator. He was meant to be the replacement. Olivia's breath hitched as she pushed open the nursery door. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself had been holding its breath. Then she saw him. Ethan lay motionless in the center of the room, his arms sprawled, his face deathly pale. Tiny, faint handprints covered his skin. Hundreds of them, as if something had touched him over and over. "Ethan!" She dropped to her knees, shaking him. His eyelids fluttered, but his lips parted with a soft, ragged breath, as though something had been inside his lungs before he took it back. The security monitor behind them flickered to life. The grainy footage played in silence. Lucy stood over Ethan. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. She was there, watching, smiling. And then, ever so slowly, she leaned down, her lips almost brushing his ear. The screen cut to black. Ethan gasped, bolting upright. His hands clenched the floor, nails digging into the cold tile. Olivia exhaled in relief, until she saw his face. He turned toward her, and smiled. But Olivia knew. That wasn't Ethan's smile.